Hello and welcome back to Bombshells. I'm Fleur Elizabeth.
And I'm Amy Jemima.
And today we are joined by the Honourable Toby Young.
Right.
I was just reading about this earlier because just wanted to do the tagline of you don't really need much of an introduction anyway, but your Wikipedia page says that the Honourable Toby Young. And then I read an article that you wrote for The Guardian about how you'd dropped honourable because it was the age of the common man, and then you you thought you'd used it in America to impress American girls, and you got an American Express card that said Hon Young.
Yeah. And it was like every time I pulled it out, they thought I'd stolen it from a Korean medical student or something. It was hopeless. Yeah.
It was so funny. I was sat on my desk laughing away. But yeah. So how have you been?
Been okay, yeah. I was just telling Amy that I went on a 5-week tour of New Zealand and Australia at the invitation of the New Zealand and Australian free speech unions. Mm-hmm. There was one set up in New Zealand in 21 and then Australia last year, and did a kind of whistle-stop tour of lots of different places in New Zealand and Australia, which was great. I mean, I hadn't been there. I'd never been to New Zealand before, and hadn't been to Australia since I was 11. So it was fantastic to spend a bit of time in that part of the world.
Yeah, that's cool. But I assume now you've got to be back because free speech is under more threat than ever.
Yeah. I mean, it's been quite shocking just how relentless this government's assault on free speech has been.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't expect them to be friends of free speech, but I didn't expect their assault to be quite this ferocious. I mean, I was quite surprised that Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, decided to effectively torpedo the Freedom of Speech Act, which, enjoyed cross-party support in the last Parliament. So the Free Speech Union is legally challenging Bridget Phillipson. We think the decision was unlawful, and she was acting ultra vires. If you want to get rid of the act, repeal it. But what you've done is, we think, unlawful. And so we'll see what happens there. And then we had all the prosecutions of people who've said supposedly inflammatory things on social media in connection with the summer riots, and some of them have been, unbelievable. People being prosecuted for sharing, contentious memes. One guy, he was sent down for 3 years. One of his sins, according to the BBC report on the BBC News website, was anti-establishment rhetoric. I mean, I don't think that was his only sin, but to even list that as one of the sins he'd been sent down for was really shocking.
Scary.
And of course, the government have said they intend to introduce a fully trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices, which we think will mean that parents and health professionals wanting to, talk adolescents out of having irreversible medical procedures could be liable for prosecution, which is obviously dreadful. And there are other things we think are in the pipeline. Yvette Cooper's talked about ramping up the kind of non-crime hate incident regime to, so more people that have been quote unquote Islamophobic get their collars felt, get marched down to police stations and have non-crime hate incidents recorded against them, which means, if you apply for a job as a carer or a teacher, can show up on an enhanced DBS check, it means you can't get the job. I don't think it's inconceivable that the government will force newspapers and magazines to bend the knee to a state regulator of the press.
Yeah.
There are just all sorts of horrors, I think, coming down the pipe. So the Free Speech Union's never been more important.
You're going to have your hands very full. But before we get into that too much, we're doing a new segment where we've asked our guests to bring in an item for show and tell. Hopefully, Toby's got one with an interesting story behind it.
So I when you asked me this, I racked my brains. But I then, as I was leaving the house, I saw this on the kitchen table, which is it's a ticket to Queen's Park Rangers and Charlton Athletic. It was, I think, a cup game, and the ticket is dated 17th of March 2020. And the reason it has meaning is because that was the first football game that was cancelled as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things I found really hard about the lockdown was, I mean, it sounds kind of pathetic and kind of minor compared to some of the, injustices other people suffered. But one of the things I found most difficult was not being able to go to football matches. It was the one thing I did with my children. It was pretty much the only thing I do outside of work. And so that really affected me. And more generally, I thought the lockdown was a catastrophic mistake and set up Lockdown Skeptics, which then became the Daily Skeptic, which was a sort of hub for people who, thought the lockdown was a ridiculous idea and often found themselves very isolated, even within their families, because they were the only person who thought it was a ridiculous idea. But, it's transpired that actually it probably was a ridiculous idea, though, people just don't want to talk about it anymore. But that was the I was kind of, I was sort of, I guess, pretty red-pilled already, but really I took many more red pills during the lockdown period, and it's what turned me into, I guess, an even more passionate defender of our liberties.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that is good.
Yeah.
Which was your team?
Queen's Park Rangers.
Okay, there we go.
Can I just ask, when you were doing the the Lockdown Skeptic, at the time, just calling it the Lockdown Skeptic, did you think you were going to be on the other hand of legal challenge?
Well, I think I originally decided I was originally going to call it. I think I was originally going to call it like COVID Skeptics, but then I thought, people are then going to accuse me of being a COVID denialist, someone who claims that actually the virus doesn't exist, it's just the product of 5G masks or whatever, and the whole thing is just a scamdemic or whatever. So I thought, no, that wouldn't be sensible. So I then changed the name at the last minute to Lockdown Skeptics, which I think is actually, I thought would be a perfectly respectable and defensible position. I didn't realize then, I don't think, quite how persecuted Lockdown Skeptics would be. And I didn't realize that, Harvard medical scientists would end up losing their jobs because they were kind of openly skeptical about the effectiveness of the lockdowns. I thought that, it wouldn't be possible or particularly easy to air skeptical views about the lockdown and other pandemic restrictions in the mainstream media. And I used to get invited onto the BBC, 2 or 3 times a week. But when I sort of declared that I was a Lockdown Skeptics, that was it. I didn't get a single invitation to appear on the BBC for something like 18 months. And I was able to write skeptical things for The Telegraph, but then someone complained to IPSO, the press regulator, who, needless to say, upheld the complaint about something I wrote. And after that, The Telegraph stopped publishing anything skeptical I wrote. Even The Spectator wasn't that keen on me kind of, airing my skeptical views. The Spectator was pretty good, much better than 99% of the rest of the media on the lockdown issue. But I think they just got fed up with me riding that hobby horse week in, week out. So, one of the reasons for starting Lockdown Skeptics was a kind of space where we skeptics could kind of bore each other, to death by just complaining endlessly. And also, we published a lot of scientists making perfectly valid criticisms of the lockdown policy and subsequently of the COVID vaccines.
But you just seem to pick up something and run with it when you've already got so many other things going on. Like when I was reading through your Wikipedia, I was just like, how have you done so much?
Short attention span.
And such a variety as well. Like London Review, Vanity Fair. What do you think your upbringing had a role in the boldness that you approach everything with? Or
well, I guess I'm slightly unusual in that I've started quite a few things.
Yeah.
Like set up quite a few things. So as you say, I started this magazine called the Modern Review.
Modern Review.
When I left, I was doing a PhD at Cambridge, but sort of binned out and was looking for something to do, so set up this magazine with Julie Burchill and Cosmo Landesman, and then, but then I set up my first magazine when I was at primary school, set up this magazine called The Outlaw. When I was like 9. So when I set up the Modern Review, aged kind of 27, I was able to say that I'd been in the magazine publishing business for 17 years. But I started the magazine at Oxford too. But none of them were terribly successful. I mean, the Modern Review was a success d'estime, and we published lots of, great writers for the first time, like Will Self and Nick Hornby. But it eventually went kind of belly up. But then I kind of got out of the kind of innovation business, ceased to be an entrepreneur, but then got back into it when I got married and had children, and so got involved in the free school movement and ended up co-founding 4 schools and a multi-academy trust, which now has 10 schools in it, as well as a fundraising arm for that. And then worked at this charity called the New Schools Network, which helped teachers and parent groups set up schools. And then, got cancelled in 2018. Boring story. And thankfully, everyone's forgotten the reasons why, so I don't want to remind them necessarily. And then set up the Free Speech Union, mainly because when I was cancelled and at the kind of eye of a Twitter storm over shit I'd said on social media kind of years ago. Some people dredged up stuff I'd said in 1987, which was kind of 31 years earlier. This was in 2018. Anyway, the offence archaeologists basically kind of set to work and found this Tutankhamun's tombs world of kind of things to be offended by. And so I stepped down from this nothing burger of a job I'd been appointed to. And then they came for me on all my other jobs, and I ended up having to step down from 5 positions. But when that was happening to me, I remember thinking, if only there was an organisation out there that could advise me what to do. Should I get out there on the airwaves, defend myself, or would it be better to kind of lie doggo? Should I apologise, or will that make things worse? Spoiler, it makes things worse. And also, is there anyone else who's gone through this you could put me in touch with, who could give me a bit of moral support and tell me what helped them? But there was no organisation like that. It was sort of in the infancy of cancel culture. So when I recovered my bearings, I thought, well, I'll set up that organisation, and that was the sort of wellspring for the Free Speech Union. And then I wasn't expecting to set up Lockdown Skeptics, but I was just so horrified, I suppose, by the lockdown, which seemed, I think Lord Sumption described it as the greatest interference in our liberty in English history. And also just kind of amazed that so many people seemed to be going along with it and weren't as horrified as me, that I really felt I had to do something. And I'm not sort of naturally someone who goes out and organises protests or who kind of, goes on hunger strike or anything like that. So I thought, well, I'll do what, comes naturally to me. I'll set up a kind of news publishing site. And then that kind of, it was kind of successful enough and attracted enough readers to be worth kind of keeping going with, even when, the lockdown restrictions were lifted. So it became the Daily Skeptic. But I think the reason I've started all these things is because my father was a social entrepreneur. So he started a ton of things. I think he started about 50 things over the course of his lifetime. So he set up Which Magazine. He was one of the founders of the Open University. Set up the National Consumers Association, University of the Third Age, like a ton of things. And so I was sort of brought up in a household
around
in which,
conviction.
Yeah, and my father thinking that if you want to create an institution or an organisation, it's possible. This is how you do it.
Yeah, and you've helped a lot of people that I've met as well. A lot of TERFs. But who were the people that really stay quite are quite big people in your memory of people that you've helped?
Well, one of the earliest people we helped was a guy called Stuart, who worked at a radio station in the Isle of Man. And at the height of the BLM imbroglio, he got into an on-air argument with a sort of wokester about whether or not white privilege existed. And he is white, was brought up in a working class household, has had to fight for, everything he's achieved in his life. It didn't feel remotely privileged or that any of what he'd achieved was unearned in any sense. So he got into a kind of spat with, I think the caller was black, and someone complained to the Isle of Man equivalent of Ofcom, and he was suspended while that investigation took place. And we went to bat for him and wrote to the investigating authority and threatened them with legal action if he was fired from his radio station or if he was censured and so forth, and threatened the radio station as well. And he was eventually was exonerated and reinstated. And now he's a member of the Isle of Man Parliament. And he stood as a kind of free speech candidate and mentioned the Free Speech Union in his kind of little manifesto on his sort of, so that sticks in the mind as a kind of really successful outcome. But yeah, we've incredibly, about 40%, we've fought over 2,700 cases in what is nearly 5 years now since first created the Free Speech Union, and 40% of them have been gender-critical feminists, TERFs, who got into trouble for because they believe in the biological reality of sex. I mean, it's incredible. People, I don't think, realise the scale of the intolerance of what we would regard as a completely kind of ordinary, uncontroversial point of view.
Yeah, and I think conversation around it is now moving from gender critical beliefs to having the right to no beliefs, like an absence of belief.
Yes,
because it is actual fact.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
True.
Yeah.
So it's
it's true. I think under the Equality Act, not believing in something is also protected in certain circumstances. So we won a victory in which someone had been penalised for a guy called Sean Corby for not believing in critical race theory. And he was accused of being racist because he challenged some of the nonsensical claims of the critical race theorists at his place of work. I think it was ACAS. And we got the panel at the Employment Tribunal to rule that actually not believing in critical race theory is protected. You can't be fired for not believing in critical race theory, which is actually a huge victory.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's important. I think it's important that people shouldn't be. You shouldn't feel compelled to express a belief that you don't actually hold, and that's as bad as having to suppress the belief that you do actually hold. It's worse in some ways.
When we were at the Free Speech Union birthday, the video that showed just a little clips of people's stories like made me so emotional, because I think a lot of people would wrongly assume that the people that go to the Free Speech Union are provocative people who are just like trying to get in trouble, trying to get a reaction. They were just normal people saying normal things, and then their lives are completely upturned. But then when they said that the Free Speech Union had been able to turn that around for them, it's like it's just so valuable.
Yeah, and it's very rewarding work, because
I bet
you're constantly kind of reaching out to people at their lowest ebb, and they really are at a loss as to what to do, how to fight what is effectively a witch hunt, you know, which they hadn't been expecting at all. They haven't provoked it, as you say, 99 times out of 100. It's a completely unexpected reaction to something they've said that they had no idea was now completely unacceptable.
Yeah,
you've got a woman at who works at, well, I won't say where she works because I'm not sure she wants to go public with it, but she got into trouble because she said the Chinese lot in an email, like an in-house email. It's like a film festival, and they were showcasing some new Chinese film, and she said the Chinese lot are really dragging their feet, and she didn't realise. Who does? That was a reference to foot binding. That's the origin of the phrase. And to associate the Chinese with foot binding is a kind of cultural stereotype. So she was accused of anti-Chinese racism, not by, needless to say, a Chinese person, but by a kind of privately educated, woke female colleague.
As it often is.
That's just cruel, because they know she didn't mean that.
Of course they know, it's ridiculous. But yeah, so it's you know, you're helping people who are at a really low ebb, and often when they find themselves, you know, at the wrong end of a kind of pitchfork mob, their friends aren't there for them. You know, their friends are terrified that if they publicly defend them or, you know, stand beside them, that, you know, the mob will come for them too, and they often do. So they're often quite isolated. So they're incredibly grateful when we show up and we, you know, we help. one of the first things we do is tell them not to feel ashamed, not to feel like they've done anything wrong. It's extraordinary how often people who do get into trouble for something they've said try and rationalise it. Say, well, maybe I shouldn't have said it, or maybe I should have known that was an unacceptable thing to say. Maybe I have been the beneficiary of white privilege, and I need to check my privilege, or whatever it is. They'll kind of try and invent reasons. It's called the just world fallacy, and I found myself doing this when I was cancelled. And a psychologist who was also cancelled explained to me that what I was suffering from was the just world fallacy, in which you, as a practicing Catholic, you probably don't think it is a fallacy.
A Protestant.
Sorry, Anglican. But the belief that we live in a just universe, and that there is some rhyme or reason to everything, and that if something bad happens to you, there must be a reason for it. You must, at some level, have done something to deserve it, because there is this kind of force in the universe which is guaranteeing justice prevails at the end of the day. So I didn't think I even believed in that when I was cancelled, but I did find myself trying to rationalise why I'd been cancelled and searching for reasons why I deserved it. And often we find that when people are cancelled, that's their kind of immediate response. They kind of try and kind of defend the people that are cancelling them.
Yeah.
And they feel guilty, and they're not quite sure what they should be guilty about, and they search for things to feel bad about, so they can kind of maintain their illusion that they live in a just world, and that what's happened to them isn't just kind of completely unjust. So one of the things we have to do is sit down and kind of knock that out of them and say, no, what's happened to you is unfair, and you need to fight back.
Yeah, it honestly sounds like you are describing my exact experience, which led me to joining the Free Speech Union, which thankfully I didn't end up having to use, but I got a pin badge. But I got cancelled at uni, and all of my friends, like a couple of them privately messaged me being like, you shouldn't be going through this, but they all deserted me. I kept saying like, maybe my beliefs are wrong and maybe I am the bad guy, because otherwise why would they react like this? And I felt completely alone, and but got through it.
Well, it's really hard when you feel insane. You're made to feel gaslit to a point where you feel insane.
Yeah.
And to then have
I
felt
like I was a bad person. I didn't think I was crazy. I just felt like I was a bad person.
I've noticed that if the people we've helped on the left who've been cancelled, they find it more difficult. I mean, the people doing the cancelling, 99 times out of 100, are people on the left. So if you're on the left and you're cancelled, you feel like you're being ejected by your own tribe.
Yeah.
And that makes it much more difficult than if you're a conservative, who a cancel mob comes for, because, the people coming for you have always been your political enemies. But if it's people you regard as your allies, your friends, people on the right side of history, like you, then it's much more difficult, and people are much more likely to go through this kind of, rationalizing process in which they try and find a reason why their tribe is right to reject them.
Yeah. So, as the founder of the Free Speech Union, with probably more of a knowledge of what the temperature is like at the moment, how do you view the state of free speech in the UK right now?
Well, it's in a pretty parlous state. I mean, when I set up the Free Speech Union, I imagined that we'd reached rock bottom, that the free speech crisis, in our universities, in public institutions, couldn't get any worse, that we'd reached the low point, and things could only get better. And I naively thought that, we as a lobby group could campaign to repeal some of the laws which restricted what we're able to say. And that was obviously naive. First there was the lockdown a few weeks after I'd founded the Free Speech Union, and then there was the Black Lives Matter imbroglio, and, cancel culture was just turbo boosted by both of those things. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world found themselves in trouble for kind of criticising the lockdown policy and then the COVID vaccines, particularly people in medical professions like nursing and so forth. And then enormous numbers of people found themselves in trouble for challenging some of the kind of shibboleths of the BLM movement, just challenging the idea that Britain is structurally racist, that could get you into trouble. We looked after people, lots of people who got into trouble for precisely that. So things got worse by an order of magnitude almost immediately. And it was like, I was like I felt like someone falling through a building. And when you hit, you finally your feet touch bottom, you think, oh, thank God. And then suddenly the floor gives way again. And it's like, ah! But it feels a bit like that. And I didn't think things could get any worse than they had over the past 4 years. And then Labour wins with kind of less than 1 in 5 people, or 1 in 5 people voting for them, and suddenly it gets worse again. And I think I think Keir Starmer is the kind of his assault on free speech is almost unprecedented in Britain's history. I mean, you have to go back to Oliver Cromwell when he banned the theatre to find anything like someone as authoritarian. As censorious as Keir Starmer and his ministers. The scale of the prosecutions of people who've, just said things on social media since, or not even said them, but just, reposted things other people have said in the past month has been extraordinary. Nothing I thought I'd ever see in this country. We're the birthplace of, parliamentary democracy. And, having kind of the Director of Public Prosecutions warned that if you even post something on social media which includes riot footage, you could go to prison. I mean, we were living in a banana republic. I mean, it's just totally, shocking. And, from my point of view, it's been great for trade. The Free Speech Union in the past month has grown by 25%.
Wow,
so
good.
we began the month of July with something like 14,000 members. We now have over 18,000. We signed up more people in an hour a couple of weeks ago than we did in the whole of June. And it now means our case teams are kind of completely deluged with more work. But, we like more work. And if needs be, we'll hire more members of our case team. And we've got a 4-person legal team, and we're all kind of flat out. But it's great that people are discovering that we're there and realising they need us.
So when did ministers become so cavalier with inviting social justice into law? When was that?
When it benefits them?
Well, I think it's been. I think there's been a long march through the institutions, and gradually. The radical progressive left has become more and more influential within the judiciary, within the civil service, within our political parties, in the Palace of Westminster. And I think it's a process that's been happening over the last 50 years, maybe even the last 75 years. But now that the march is almost completed, it's becoming more and more obvious just what's happened. And, we think, we've reached peak woke. I keep thinking we've reached peak woke, only to, for the floor to give way again. But in these institutions, they're not going to be recaptured anytime soon. And it's extraordinary. You discover kind of like, things you wouldn't expect to be captured, like, the knitting community. Like, I've got this friend who wrote this fantastic piece for Quillette. I used to be an editor at Quillette, this Australian online magazine. And she wrote a fantastic piece about kind of about people who'd fallen afoul of kind of sacred woke values in the world of knitting. I mean, who knew knitting would be susceptible to kind of a woke takeover? But, they've got their fingers in everything. It's just shocking.
Yeah. So simultaneously, people are being arrested and given pretty extreme sentences for, like, reposting something. And they announced that criminals are going to be released earlier in their sentence. And this is where two-tier policing is coming
It's
from
extraordinary,
as well.
isn't it? And yet we're told that the idea that we have two-tier policing, the idea that there are dual standards in our criminal justice system more generally.
Wait, is it a crime to say that we have two-tier policing?
It's not a crime, but it's been described, I've seen many times, as a conspiracy theory. Like the idea that we have two-tier policing or a two-tier criminal justice system is now described as a conspiracy theory, as misinformation, and many people petitioning the government to do more, to clamp down on misinformation and disinformation on social media, complaining that the Online Safety Act doesn't go far enough. That's the kind of misinformation they'd like to see banned from social media. Anyone claiming that we have two-tier policing in this country, even though it's just blindingly obvious across many dimensions. It's. I think a lot of the reason, I think a big part of the reason the government has been clamping down on things people have said on social media, and I think they are going to increase their powers under the Online Safety Act and effectively order Ofcom to order social media platforms to remove vast swathes of content that was perfectly reasonable 5 minutes ago, is because they want to stamp out criticism. They want to stamp out dissent. They don't want to argue about these things in the public square. They want to cast anyone who doesn't sign up to radical progressive ideology as beyond the pale.
So what do you do if the judges, regardless of what kind of free speech laws are in place, what do you do if the judges are captured by sort of social justice, virtue signalling, woke ideology?
Someone tweeted that a lot of the judges that were involved in prosecuting people for the riots had let paedophiles and stuff get away with it. So they clearly are captured.
Well, my experience is that the higher up the kind of judicial food chain you go, the less likely judges are to be captured. I think they came under a lot of pressure to dole out stiff sentences in the past month by the Attorney General, by the Prime Minister, by the Director of Public Prosecutions, by the Crown Prosecution Service, because they were kind of effectively told that if you don't dole out these harsh sentences, the rioting will continue. We have to stamp this out. We have to send a message that this kind of activity, or even encouraging this kind of activity on social media, is going to land you in jail.
So do you believe that the law is the law when it comes down to it?
I think, no. I don't think justice is blind. I think that people who are categorised as far right are much more likely to be sent to prison if they come up before a magistrate or a judge. Than someone who's an Extinction Rebellion protester.
There's a class aspect there as well.
There's also a class dimension to it, yeah. But one of the things which has been one of the few pleasant surprises since setting up the Free Speech Union has been discovering that the law is quite often on the side of people who are being persecuted. I mean, if they haven't said anything or done anything unlawful and they're being persecuted, they've been fired, for instance, or they've been kicked out of a university or kicked out of a professional association for saying nothing unlawful. Quite often the law is actually on their side. I mean, Maya Forstater discovered this when initially the Employment Tribunal, when she said, I've been fired for being a gender-critical feminist, that's discrimination. The original Employment Tribunal said, no, believing in the biological reality of sex is not a point of view that's acceptable in democratic society, or something, words to that effect. I mean, extraordinary. But she appealed that to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and the Appeal Tribunal said, no, that is an acceptable point of view to hold in a democratic society. And thereafter, it became a protected belief, and it became discrimination to fire someone just for expressing that belief. So there are victories you can win, and the law actually can be on your side, and I think that's that's the way, that's our best option at the moment to defend free speech. And I think the way to fight this government's assault on free speech will be via the courts. That's why the Free Speech Union is applying for a judicial review. We're asking the High Court to decide whether or not Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, has acted unlawfully in torpedoing the Freedom of Speech Act. And we don't think it's a foregone conclusion that they'll say no and just support the government.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that, there'll be many other legal challenges that will be behind to protect free speech, over the next 5 years.
Another difficult area for you to tackle is the whole thing of fact-checking. So how does the Free Speech Union cope with this whole idea of fact-checking and everything's got to be factual if you post anything? Why the general public, Brian down the road, will just say a random thing maybe after a glass of wine and it's claiming something. If that's untrue, why is he being held to such a high standard?
Like when one person tweeted that the killer in Southport was a fresh off the boat illegal immigrant, which was false, but other people believed it, and then they're the ones that get in trouble, right?
Mm.
Yes, no, that particular woman is a member of the Free Speech Union, and she hasn't been charged yet. So she was arrested and held, I think, for 36 hours in police custody, and they confiscated all her devices. But they haven't yet found, I think, they're looking at her, I think, for 2 offences. One is stirring up racial hatred, just for tweeting that, and the other is for knowingly publishing something she knew to be false.
How'd they prove that?
Well, quite difficult to prove. One of the things they're trying to prove as part of proving that, I think, is that she was the first person to say it. So if she can show that actually she wasn't, she was just, she got it from somewhere else, then it looks less like she was sort of knowingly making it up. And I don't think, I completely believe that she did see it somewhere else and was just repeating something she'd seen somewhere else and didn't know it was false. And actually she said, if this is true, in the tweet in question. And then she took it down when she had reason to think it wasn't. So she hasn't been charged yet. I'd be amazed if she is charged. But there is this new offence under the Online Safety Act, which came into force in January of this year, whereby you can now be prosecuted for publishing something that you know to be false and which causes harm. And of course,
what happens to satire then? If people don't understand it, because I've made jokes on Twitter that people have not got that it was a joke.
Yeah,
we really angry about it.
What? Quite a few of them. We haven't actually done a calculation to see what percentage of the cases the Free Speech Union fought have been people telling jokes, but it's pretty high. It's extraordinary how often people get into trouble for saying something that's quite obviously a joke. But one of the problems with fact checking, with trying to persuade social media companies to remove misinformation, for trying to prosecute people for supposedly disseminating harmful disinformation, is that it's often in the eye of the beholder. Misinformation is often just a euphemism for a kind of point of view that I, as a radical progressive, disagree with or disapprove of. And there's nothing actually factually wrong about it. The Daily Skeptic, which is, amongst other things, climate contrarian, gets fact-checked all the time. And all the fact checkers, almost all of them are left of centre and funded by kind of left-wing NGOs, often, funded themselves by George Soros. And they, instead of saying, here's the argument for net zero, these are the trade-offs, this is why we think you're wrong and we're right. Instead of actually having a kind of grown-up debate, which is, which we'd enjoy because we think they're wrong, they just say, oh, no, you're factually wrong. This is misinformation. And look, here's our fact checker to prove it. And, often the fact checkers, all it amounts to is saying this scientist, and this scientist, who incidentally are completely captured because they're paid by the kind of climate lobby to produce their research. They say that what you've said is wrong. Therefore, it's wrong. Therefore, it's misinformation. Therefore, your publication should be shut down. It's a pathetic, kind of infantile way to prosecute an argument in the public square, but they don't want to argue.
No.
They just want to cast you out as a wrong 'un.
Yeah. Well, I was recently in Hungary, fantastic country, and I went to the House of Terror Museum, which is where the secret police used to torture and kill people. And being there at the time when all of the riots were going on, everyone was getting arrested for just saying things that aren't allowed. I was just starting to get quite scared. Like, this... People always say, oh, it's a free country. Is it anymore?
Well, people don't even say that anymore, do they? They don't.
I
don't
said it the
appeal
other day
to
and
that
then I
idea
caught
to-
myself and I was like, wait.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very true.
Well, one. I think there are parallels with the Soviet era and what's
Yeah.
happening now. And one good example of that is that under the Scottish Hate Crime Act, which came into force on April Fool's Day of all days earlier this year, the dwelling defence has been effectively repealed. It used to be that you couldn't be prosecuted for stirring up hatred in your own home if it was your own private dwelling, and that was known as the dwelling defence.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been scrapped now. So that raises the spectre of children being summoned to court to testify against their parents, which is exactly what happened in Mao's China and in Stalin's Soviet Union.
Yeah.
In Scotland, it's not out of the question that someone could be reported for hate speech in their kitchen, saying they don't think trans women are women or genetically male boxers should be able to win
What if a
Olympic
neighbour
medals, whatever.
overhears you through your open window or someone bugs you in your home?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's and I wouldn't be at all surprised if the present government passes a Westminster version of the Scottish Hate Crime Act and repeals the dwelling defence in this country too.
Could children, let's say a 12-year-old, 13-year-old child, report their parent for hate speech?
They could.
Against them, or hate crime against them?
Yes. And in Scotland they've created
crazy.
I think something like 250 hate crime reporting centres where you can report people for if you think they've committed a hate crime. Most of them, believe it or not, are in universities.
Yes. Why does
But there
that
was
surprise me?
famously one in a sex shop in Glasgow, an LGBT sex shop in Glasgow. So you could kind of, buy a dildo and report your parents for hate crime at the same time. I mean, it's just ridiculous. In theory, a child could say to their parent in Scotland, you better give me more pocket money, Dad, or I'm going to report you for a hate crime.
That's horrific. Is it hate crime to say I hate this country right now?
No.
Okay.
Say you love your country. That's a hate crime. For
Okay, right. That's tough for me to say right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, it's been great having you on, and hoping we don't have to be in touch for anything that we've talked about.
You know where to come.
Yeah. Could you just tell people where to find the Free Speech Union if it's not?
Yeah. So if for some extraordinary reason anyone listening or watching this show has not yet joined, it's dirt cheap, and it'll be the best money you've ever spent if you ever get into trouble. And you can do that by going to freespeechunion.org/join/ and it's only, if you're a student or a veteran or retired, it's only $29.99. Otherwise, full membership is $59.99. But if you ever get into trouble, the amount of money we'll spend helping you, including on your legal defence if necessary, will dwarf anything you've put in. It's like an insurance policy, a much needed, increasingly needed insurance policy. And if anyone wants to check out the Daily Skeptic, that's dailyskeptic.org.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching and listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe and leave us a lovely comment. Bye.
Bye.